Why do human beings, in every culture and every era, seem drawn to the idea of gods, spirits, and an afterlife? If you trace it back far enough, the roots almost always lead to one simple, universal truth. We are the only creatures fully aware of our own mortality. We know with absolute certainty that one day we will die. This awareness is both a gift and a curse. It gives us the ability to reflect, to create meaning, to make plans. But it also burdens us with the most profound fear imaginable, the fear of not existing at all. This fear of death is not just background noise in our lives. It shapes civilizations, drives art and philosophy, and underpins most systems of belief. If you look closely, the promises of religion, heaven, reincarnation, eternal life, even spiritual continuation, are all designed to answer that one terrible question: what happens when I die? The human brain does not deal well with the unknown, and death is the greatest unknown of all. We can't observe it directly, we can't return from it with certainty, and we can't master it the way we master other problems. So instead of facing its silence head-on, people have always created stories to soften it. Belief in God often functions as the ultimate safety net, the guarantee that we're not walking into a void. Psychologists call this terror management. When confronted with reminders of death, people become more likely to cling to their cultural or religious beliefs. Studies have shown that even subtle reminders of mortality, like walking past a cemetery or being asked to write about one's death, can increase religious conviction. It's not always about theology or doctrine. At the root, it's about psychological survival. Consider how religions frame death. In Christianity, it's not the end but the doorway to eternal life. In Islam, it's the passage into paradise for the faithful. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it's a cycle that leads to eventual liberation. In indigenous traditions, the dead are often seen as ancestors watching over the living. Different forms, different details, but the same core function, transforming the terror of annihilation into a narrative of continuation. This isn't a coincidence. It's an adaptive strategy. Humans who believed in comforting stories about life after death may have had an advantage in coping with loss, maintaining social bonds, and finding motivation to live meaningful lives. Entire societies could organize themselves more easily if people felt their actions carried eternal consequences. Fear of death in this sense became a kind of fuel for belief. But here's the tension. Fear doesn't make something true. The fact that a belief comforts us is not evidence that it reflects reality. If anything, it should make us more cautious. Because if the primary appeal of a belief is emotional reassurance, we have to ask whether we're accepting it because it's real or because we desperately want it to be. Think about the way children develop. At some point, every child realizes that people die. For many, it's the first brush with existential fear. Parents trying to protect them often say things like, "Grandma is in heaven now," or "She's watching over us." Those words don't come from malice. They come from compassion, a desire to shield young minds from despair. But they also plant seeds. From an early age, death is framed not as a final end, but as a transition. By the time those children grow up, belief in some kind of afterlife feels natural, almost obvious, even though it was never based on evidence. Now, think about what happens when people are faced with their own mortality in adulthood. Terminal illness, aging, or sudden loss. These experiences have a way of stripping away the distractions of daily life. In those moments, religion can rush in with ready-made answers. That's one reason why even people who never cared much about religion sometimes turn toward it near the end of life. It offers closure, it offers hope. Yet we have to ask, does accepting a comforting story actually help us live more fully, or does it hold us back from facing reality? There's a difference between easing anxiety and truly understanding what it means to be alive. The fear of death is not just personal, it also shapes societies. Leaders and religious authorities have long used it as a tool of control. Promises of heaven and threats of hell, blessings of eternal reward and punishments of eternal torment. These are powerful motivators. If you want to guide behavior, there's no greater lever than telling people their eternal fate depends on obedience. Here again, fear of death doesn't just fuel belief. It fuels compliance. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all the variations, despite centuries of theological debate, not one religion has been able to prove its claims about life after death. Every system is built on faith, tradition, and stories handed down, not on verifiable evidence. That should tell us something. If humans are so deeply afraid of death, and if that fear has existed as long as we have, then of course we would invent explanations. Of course we would cling to them. The sheer universality of afterlife beliefs may say more about human psychology than about the universe itself. There's also a darker side. Fear of death doesn't only push people toward belief in comforting gods, it also makes them susceptible to manipulation. Throughout history, countless wars, crusades, and acts of violence have been justified by the promise of eternal life or the threat of damnation. People are often willing to die and to kill if they believe their soul will live on in glory. That willingness comes directly from the human terror of ceasing to exist, reworked into a narrative of immortality. Now, none of this is meant to diminish the pain of mortality. Death is hard. Losing people we love is devastating. Facing our own end can be overwhelming. It's natural to look for solace, but recognizing the psychological mechanics at work is liberating in its own way. Once you see that belief in God is so tightly tied to fear of death, you can begin to ask, what if that fear is driving us to accept illusions? What if courage isn't found in hoping for eternity, but in embracing the finite? Because here's the truth. Being mortal also gives life urgency. It forces us to value time, relationships, and experiences. If we lived forever, would we really cherish the moments we have? Would we strive, love, and create with the same intensity? Mortality, as painful as it is also what makes existence precious. If we look at the history of religion, it's remarkable how consistently the theme of death and what comes after sits at the center. Think of the Egyptian pyramids. These enormous monuments weren't built as palaces for the living. They were tombs. Entire economies and labor forces were mobilized to prepare pharaohs for the afterlife. The mummification process, the treasures buried with the dead, the elaborate rituals, all of it reflects one idea: that death is not final, and that how you live determines how you exist beyond the grave. Without fear of death, would such immense effort have been poured into preserving corpses and preparing souls? Probably not. The same holds true across cultures. In ancient China, emperors drank elixirs hoping to achieve immortality. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, the Church sold indulgences promising to shorten people's time in purgatory. In modern times, you can find entire industries built around near-death experiences, psychic mediums, or books claiming to reveal glimpses of heaven. The faces change, the rituals change, but the underlying driver stays the same. Human beings cannot easily accept the idea of ceasing to exist. And yet we know from science that death is a natural part of life. Every organism dies. Every cell in our body carries a biological clock. Species come and go, planets form and collapse, stars are born and eventually burn out. On a cosmic scale, death isn't just an unfortunate accident. It's built into the structure of reality. To pretend otherwise may comfort us, but it doesn't align with what we observe. This raises a crucial question. Why is non-existence so terrifying to us? After all, we didn't exist before we were born, and that absence doesn't seem to trouble anyone. The centuries before our birth were experienced the same way we'll experience death, with no awareness at all. And yet, because we've tasted consciousness, we cling to it. The idea of letting it go feels unbearable. This is where belief in God often steps in, promising continuity. Instead of disappearing, we'll continue, just in another form. Instead of nothingness, we'll have reunion, reward, or renewal. But here's the problem. These promises aren't based on evidence we can test. They're based on hope and tradition. And while hope can be powerful, it doesn't change reality. If someone told you they had a pill that would let you live forever, you wouldn't just believe them because the idea makes you feel good. You'd ask for proof. Yet when it comes to religion, people suspend that demand for proof precisely because the stakes feel so high. The fear of death lowers the bar of skepticism. Modern psychology has a term for this: motivated reasoning. It's when we believe something not because the evidence points to it, but because we want it to be true. And when it comes to death, the motivation couldn't be stronger. If you're scared of the void, then any story that fills that void with comfort becomes deeply attractive. Consider near-death experiences, often cited as evidence of life after death. People describe tunnels of light, feelings of peace, or visions of loved ones. But neuroscience offers explanations. When the brain is starved of oxygen, visual and auditory hallucinations are common. The sensation of moving through a tunnel matches the narrowing of vision as the brain shuts down. The feeling of peace can come from a flood of endorphins. These experiences feel real, but that doesn't make them evidence of another realm. They're evidence of what the brain does under extreme stress. And yet, many people cling to them as proof of something beyond, because the alternative, that death is the end, is too unsettling. There's another dimension to this. Fear of death doesn't just fuel belief in God, it also fuels the need for morality framed in eternal terms. If people only lived for this life, the argument goes, what would stop them from doing whatever they want? By promising eternal consequences, religions try to anchor morality in the fear of divine judgment. Heaven and hell aren't just answers to what happens when we die. They're tools to regulate behavior while we live. Once again, the fear of death becomes a lever of control. But do we really need eternal punishment or reward to behave ethically? Evidence suggests we don't. Secular societies with low levels of religious belief, like those in Scandinavia, often have high levels of social trust, equality, and well-being. Their citizens act morally not because they're afraid of hell, but because empathy, cooperation, and fairness are deeply human. Morality is possible without the fear of divine judgment. In fact, it may even flourish more freely when people act out of genuine concern for others, rather than fear of punishment. Another overlooked angle is how fear of death has shaped art, culture, and even progress. Much of human creativity is, in some sense, a response to mortality. We build monuments, write books, compose music, and paint works that will outlive us. These are forms of symbolic immortality. When we can't literally live forever, we try to leave something behind that carries our name or our essence into the future. Religion in this sense is just one of many strategies to deal with death. Some people turn to God. Others turn to legacy, art, or children. The fear of death is there either way. It just finds different outlets. And yet, there's a striking irony. The more we deny death, the more we can end up missing life. If we spend our years focused on the next world, we may overlook the richness of this one. How many people delay joy, sacrifice authenticity, or submit to authority, all because they believe this life is just a test for something greater? That perspective may reduce fear, but it can also rob us of freedom. To see death clearly is difficult, but it can also be liberating. It allows us to shift from asking, what comes after, to asking, what can I do now? Instead of living for eternity, we live for the relationships, the experiences, and the contributions that are within our reach. In this way, acknowledging mortality doesn't make life bleak. It makes it urgent, vivid, and meaningful. One of the clearest signs that fear of death fuels belief in God is the way religious rituals often center around mortality. Funerals, for example, are almost always framed through a religious lens. Instead of simply acknowledging that a person's life has ended, most traditions immediately turn the conversation toward where that person has gone. The service becomes less about remembering their time on earth and more about reassuring the living that the dead are not truly gone. Without that assurance, the silence of death would be unbearable. Even the language we use around death is softened by belief. We say someone has passed away, gone to a better place, or is resting in peace. These phrases all carry the same purpose. They cushion the blow of finality. Imagine if every culture simply said, they no longer exist. The rawness of that truth would hit too hard, too fast. Religion steps in to wrap death in gentler words, but the fact that we need those words tells us something important about the human condition. We're not just afraid of death itself. We're afraid of facing it without a story. This fear also shapes how societies handle justice. In many religious traditions, people who escape accountability in life are believed to face it in death. A cruel ruler, a corrupt judge, or a murderer who goes unpunished may not face consequences on earth, but in the religious imagination, they'll pay for it afterward. That belief has an emotional appeal. It feels unfair that some people get away with terrible crimes. An eternal system of reward and punishment promises cosmic balance. But it also reveals again how much of religion is about managing our discomfort with death. We don't just want our loved ones to live on. We want wrongdoers to suffer, even if it takes another world to make it happen. Yet this craving for post-death justice raises another question. If people only behave because they fear divine punishment, is that morality or just obedience? True morality requires empathy and reflection, not threats. But fear of death, coupled with fear of judgment after death, often blurs that line. It trains people to act in ways that conform to religious rules, rather than encouraging genuine ethical thinking. The influence of death anxiety isn't only found in rituals or morality. It extends into how people view authority. Leaders who claim to hold the keys to salvation gain immense power. If death is the greatest fear, then anyone who can claim to unlock eternal life instantly commands loyalty. Throughout history, kings, priests, and prophets have used this leverage. They present themselves as mediators between the mortal and the eternal, the fragile and the everlasting. People obey, not just out of respect for authority, but out of desperate hope for survival beyond the grave. Consider medieval Europe, where the church held extraordinary influence. One reason it could maintain that grip was the doctrine of hell. The average person lived in constant fear of eternal damnation. That fear made them dependent on priests, indulgences, and rituals, all framed as necessary for salvation. It wasn't just politics or economics that gave the church its power. It was its monopoly on the afterlife. When the ultimate fear is death, and someone claims to control the solution, it creates a nearly unbreakable bond of obedience. Even today, the same logic persists, just in subtler forms. Religious leaders promise comfort in funerals, strength in illness, and hope in aging. Politicians invoke God to connect their cause with something eternal. Whole industries profit from books and films that promise glimpses of heaven. The thread tying all of it together is the same: an underlying fear of death that makes people hungry for reassurance. And yet, the more you look at how fear drives belief, the more you notice contradictions. Many religions claim to remove the fear of death by offering certainty about what comes after. But look closer, and you'll see that fear never really disappears. Instead, it shifts. If one group teaches that only their followers will be saved, that creates anxiety about being in the wrong group. If heaven requires perfect faith, people worry whether theirs is strong enough. If judgment depends on morality, people live in fear of sin. The fear of death gets transformed into fear of punishment, fear of exclusion, or fear of doubt itself. Far from eliminating fear, belief often multiplies it. This also explains why people often become defensive when their beliefs are challenged. If you question someone's doctrine, you're not just questioning abstract ideas. You're poking at the emotional shield that protects them from death anxiety. That's why debates about religion can become so heated. They're not only about theology or history. At their core, they're about the most primal human fear: the end of existence. Of course, it's not just individuals who feel this fear. Entire cultures wrestle with it. Think of national myths about fallen soldiers living on in glory, or political movements that frame their cause as eternal. Even secular societies build narratives that soften the sting of mortality. But religions take this to the highest level, offering the ultimate guarantee: not just symbolic immortality, but literal immortality. It's no wonder belief in God remains so persistent, even as science explains more and more of the world. Science can explain how the body dies, but it doesn't promise survival. Religion does, and for many that promise outweighs evidence. But here's where things get interesting. While fear of death often drives belief, it can also drive disbelief. For some, the very idea of eternity is unsettling. The thought of existing forever without end can feel as suffocating as the thought of not existing at all. Philosophers have pointed out that eternal life might not be blissful, but unbearable, an endless repetition that eventually strips meaning from experience. Death, by contrast, gives shape to life. It creates beginnings and endings, and with them, a sense of story. For these people, the finality of death isn't just something to accept. It's something that gives life its intensity. This shows that the fear of death is complex. It doesn't push everyone in the same direction. But what it does, almost universally, is force people to seek meaning. And meaning is often where God enters the picture. Whether it's a deity who offers eternal life, or a divine plan that makes suffering worthwhile, God becomes the ultimate answer to the ultimate question. Without death, would we need such answers? Or would we be free to simply live? When you look closely, fear of death doesn't just push people toward religious belief. It also affects countless small choices in daily life. Think about the way people approach health, aging, and risk. Entire industries thrive on selling not just beauty or fitness, but the illusion of youth and permanence. Cosmetics, diets, anti-aging treatments, and even fringe experiments in cryonics all reflect the same underlying impulse: to delay, avoid, or even escape death. Religion isn't the only way people deal with mortality, but it's one of the most direct. By promising an afterlife, it bypasses the whole struggle and offers the ultimate reassurance: you don't need to fight death because you won't really die. This helps explain why some people resist scientific or medical perspectives that challenge comforting beliefs. For example, when evidence shows that the brain generates consciousness and that consciousness ends when the brain stops functioning, many find it deeply unsettling. Accepting this means letting go of the idea that something essential continues after death. So instead, they lean harder on belief. They say the soul is separate from the body, untouchable by science. This isn't because science has failed. It's because the emotional cost of accepting its conclusions feels too high. We can also see the impact of death anxiety in the way people treat symbols of religion. Objects like crosses, prayer beads, scriptures, or relics are often invested with enormous importance. Why? Because they're seen as lifelines to eternity. To lose them or disrespect them can feel like jeopardizing one's own safety in the face of death. Even if the object itself has no power, the fear it symbolizes makes it sacred. There's a striking irony here. On one hand, religion promises to remove the fear of death. On the other, it embeds fear into people's everyday lives. Instead of being free from fear, many believers live with constant anxiety about whether they're doing enough to secure eternal life. Are they praying enough? Believing correctly? Avoiding the wrong sins? That lingering worry never fully disappears. Fear of death doesn't get erased. It gets rebranded. This can be especially powerful when it comes to children. In many traditions, kids are taught early on that if they don't follow the right path, their soul is at risk. For a child who already struggles to grasp the concept of death, this is a heavy psychological weight. Instead of simply learning about mortality, they grow up associating death with punishment, judgment, and eternal consequences. That fear can stay with them for a lifetime, shaping decisions about relationships, career, sexuality, and identity. In this way, fear of death doesn't just fuel belief in God. It molds entire personalities, and it's not just about individuals. Death anxiety influences collective behavior. Think about how religions respond to threats. When societies face plagues, famines, or disasters, religious intensity often increases. Why? Because these moments confront people with the fragility of life. Fear spikes, and with it the need for assurance. During the Black Death in Europe, for example, the Church gained immense power by presenting itself as the only path to eternal salvation. Even as millions died, belief grew stronger. The same pattern repeats in modern times, whether in the aftermath of wars, terrorist attacks, or pandemics. The greater the brush with mortality, the greater the hunger for God. It also works in the opposite direction. When people feel safe, healthy, and secure, religion often declines. Studies have shown that societies with strong healthcare systems and social safety nets tend to be less religious. This isn't because people suddenly become more rational. It's because when fear of death is managed, when life feels less precarious, the emotional need for God weakens. Religion thrives where mortality feels close. It recedes where people feel shielded from it. Another overlooked aspect is how fear of death shapes the way religions frame time. Eternal life is often described not just as unending, but as perfection without decay. No aging, no sickness, no loss. That vision directly opposes everything we know about nature, where change and death are constant. The promise of eternity is less about describing a real destination, and more about constructing a fantasy opposite to the world we see. Heaven is everything death is not. Endless instead of brief, painless instead of full of suffering, certain instead of fragile. In that sense, belief in God functions like a mirror image of our deepest fears, flipping them upside down into promises. But this raises another question. If fear of death drives belief, does that mean religion is simply a coping mechanism? For many, that's a difficult idea to accept, because it makes faith feel less like revelation and more like psychology. Yet the evidence points in that direction. When you look at how consistently religions address death, when you look at how death anxiety increases belief, and when you look at how much power authorities gain by controlling afterlife narratives, the pattern is too strong to ignore. Still, acknowledging this doesn't have to feel bleak. Understanding why people believe can actually deepen compassion. If you know that much of belief in God is really belief against death, then you see people not as irrational, but as deeply human. You see that behind the prayers and rituals is the same fear we all share. The fear of not being here anymore. The fear of losing everyone we love. The fear of the unknown. The difference lies in how we face it. Some reach for stories of eternity. Others accept mortality and focus on the time they have. But at the root, it's the same universal struggle. That's why this topic is so powerful, because no one escapes it. From the poorest villager to the wealthiest ruler, from the most devout believer to the most secular thinker, the shadow of death shapes us all. And perhaps this is where the conversation about belief gets most interesting. Because if fear of death explains why people turn to God, it also explains why letting go of God can feel so frightening. To step away from belief is not just to reject a doctrine. It's to confront mortality without a safety net. It's to look at the void directly, without stories to soften it. That takes courage, and it opens a very different path. Not a life spent preparing for eternity, but a life spent fully in the present.